So we'll be asking you to look at lots of different arguments that are provided in more abstract contexts as well as slightly more concrete contexts, such as what you get in a newspaper article in which the author is trying to argue for a conclusion, an op-ed piece, maybe even in advertising, in political campaigns. You'll see people trying to give arguments for certain conclusions, and your job will be to take a look at some of them and see whether or not they are persuasive, whether or not they are, and that's going to break up into the questions whether or not they're valid and whether they're sound, and if not, how do they fail? What's wrong with them? And in order to help you with that task, I want to give you some examples of some fairly famous fallacies. Here's a list. There's one type of fallacy known as the fallacies, the family of fallacies known as the fallacies of composition and division. The fallacy of composition is a fallacy according to which, from the premise that a number of components of a thing have a certain property, somebody might infer that the entire aggregate has a certain property as well. So, for example, from the premise that each of the grains of sand in a large pile of sand, each of the grains of sand is small, we certainly can't infer that the entire mound or hill of sand is small. That'd be a fallacy of composition. And likewise, this fallacy of division. From the fact that a composite object has a certain property, we can't infer that the components of that object have that property as well. There might be, for example, a country that is wealthy or a country that is powerful. That does not imply that the citizens are either wealthy or powerful. Perhaps all the wealth and power are held in the hands of a very small oligarchy or something of the kind. So it's a fallacy to infer from the properties of a set of components to any conclusion about the property of the complex, and likewise it's a fallacy to infer from properties of the complex to any conclusion about the properties of the components of the complex. Here's another famous fallacy known as post hoc ergo propter hoc. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is Latin for, roughly speaking, it happened after, therefore it happened because of. So take an example such as, I pray for rain because I'm a farmer and I need my crops to grow, and lo and behold, it rains. I infer my prayers were answered. But the fallacy post hoc ergo propter hoc, it's a fallacy to reason that way, because the fact that first this happened, then that happened, does not itself show that what happened was a result of the thing that I did first. It might be that my prayers were answered, or it might just be that I got lucky, or I take the medicine and I got better. But it's a further question whether or not taking the medicine is what made me get better. Perhaps I was going to be getting better anyway. So watch out for reasoning that involves it happened implicitly, it happened afterwards, therefore it happened because of. Much more needs to be done to establish that causal relationship as opposed to just temporal precedence. Another example of a fallacy is known as the fallacy of equivocation, where we play upon different meanings or disambiguations of words or phrases. So, for example, think about the sentence, every event has a cause. Everything that happens because of some reason. Now, that could either mean there's one big reason that caused everything, or it could be everything that happens has the characteristic that there's something that caused it, but the something that caused it might not have been the same thing from case to case. Just as you might say, every person loves somebody. Well, does that mean there's one person that everybody loves? Or does it mean for everybody you find, there's at least someone that they love, who is not necessarily the same one from one person to the other? We can equivocate, as we're going to see when we talk about certain forms of the cosmological argument, equivocate on this notion of every X is related to some Y or other, and that can be a source of fallacious reasoning as well. That's the fallacy of equivocation. We also have fallacies known as ad hominem arguments, where we try to refute somebody's line of reasoning, show their line of reasoning is baseless by attacking the person that is the basis or the source of that line of reasoning. So suppose, for example, that a person is arguing that they're providing evidence that smoking is a carcinogen and is therefore bad for one's health, and an investigative reporter finds out that the scientist who's providing that evidence is herself a smoker. Now, that might be slightly embarrassing for the scientist in question to have had that fact revealed about her life, but that doesn't show that the evidence purporting to establish the carcinogenic properties of smoking is itself less good evidence than we thought. What she does in her own spare time is really irrelevant to the question whether or not her evidence supports the conclusion that she's trying to support about the carcinogenic properties of smoking. So an ad hominem argument tries to show that the person providing a line of reasoning is herself or himself illegitimate or immoral or questionable or dubious in some way. Just showing that does not itself undermine the validity or soundness of the reasoning that she's offering. Watch out for fallacies that involve that ad hominem type of attack. Likewise, people will sometimes engage in what's known as an argument from authority, trying to establish a certain proposition by appealing to the idea that someone famous believed it, said it, expressed it, or supported it. For example, just because Einstein thought something about the existence of God does not by itself show that God exists. Perhaps in spite of his genius, Einstein might have made a mistake in that particular case. Just because someone famous, a great authority figure, thinks something to be true does not itself show that it is. Likewise, another type of argument that is a little more subtle, but is one that I want you to be clear on, is known as begging the question. Where begging the question is a sort of technical notion for assuming what we're trying to establish. So when a person tries to establish a conclusion, if their premises already in some ways smuggle in the assumption that they're trying to, the proposition that they're trying to prove, then that's known as begging the question. So for example, in the book Dead Man Walking, the author Helen Prt6 describes in her support of the idea that the death penalty is immoral, she describes the death penalty with the term judicial murder. Now, it might be the case that applying the death penalty is a case of judicial murder, but if you're trying to show that the death penalty is wrong, then assuming that a judge sentencing someone to death is a form of murder already assumes that the death penalty is morally wrong, because murder is by definition morally wrong. So to describe in your argument for the conclusion that the death penalty is immoral, to describe a judge as giving somebody the death penalty as a sentence as a case of judicial murder already begs the question, that is to say, it assumes precisely what you're trying to establish. That's another kind of fallacy. And likewise, more generally, people sometimes describe arguments as being circular, as assuming what they're trying to establish. Watch out for that. That is a pitfall for arguments, but I should also say that our tools, our technology, as it were, for assessing arguments in certain terms of soundness and validity does not quite give us a powerful way to explain how that particular fallacy is in fact a fallacy. Because if you think about it, you'll see that an argument that contains as one of its premises the proposition that it's trying to establish might still be a valid one. So it's something that we'll need to be mindful of as our work together progresses. And I'll ask you to think about the question, could an argument be both sound and circular? That's something I'll be asking you to reflect on.